Events can be explosive around Cotopaxi. But then Cotopaxi is named for the world's highest volcano, more than 19,000 feet above sea level in northern Ecuador, and still active is the Cotopaxi volcano, the shimmering, shining pile of this. And indeed, events were indeed very explosive around Cotopaxi, Colorado. The tale of Cotopaxi is closely linked with everything from the agrarian idol to Russian anti-Semitism to Western mining hustling to the extreme tensions between East European and German Jews in the 19th century, particularly in New York. There's been a lot talked about, a lot said, a lot written about Cotopaxi, and all of it is amazingly contradictory. None of the names, specifics are at all hard and fast. There's rumors, there's accusations, there's boasting of that. And this was sort of the situation in the late 1870s. And by that time, the reform programs of Tsar Alexander II of Russia were in ruins. He had taken the throne in 1855 as the great reforming Tsar. Russia, when he took the throne, was on the verge of ruin. It was losing something called the Crimean War. Something had to be done, and to try to bring Russia maybe into the 18th century, and at the most into the early 19th century, Tsar Alexander launched numerous efforts, culminating in 1861 with a semi-liberation of the serfs. But despite his efforts, Russian absolutism was still very strong, very much underway. As tensions are growing in the 1870s, revolutionary movements are emerging in the Russian Empire, targeting the Tsar as a tyrant, and a lot of Jews are being attracted to the revolutionary movements. They see the old order as the bastion of anti-Semitism, state-ordered repression, discrimination, closing of schools, limiting the number of Jews allowed into any secular schools at this time. And as tensions continue to keep growing, the Tsar's response is the traditional one. You blame the Jews for everything. New anti-Semitic legislation is enacted. Efforts of Jews to try to reach out of their miserable shtetl settings are repressed by the Tsar of this. And in the wake of all of this, already in the late 1870s, there starts to be the beginning of an exodus of Jews from the Tsarist empire to the New World. And at this time, there was a very strong, very well-established German Jewish establishment, particularly in New York City. And the German Jews weren't quite clear of what to make of the Russian Jews. Compared to the German Jews that projected themselves as modern American citizens, well-educated, succeeding within the business establishment, they saw the Russian Jews as a remnant of the Middle Ages. Many of them are still dressing as if it is the 18th century, if not earlier at that time of this. Yiddish is their first language. Rather than being well-shaved modern American citizens, they often have wild beards of them itself. And a lot of the German Jews of New York don't want to have anything to do with the Russian Jews. Or maybe that's not true. Maybe they see that they are fellow religious people, they are kinsmen, they are people in need of help and improvement along the way of that itself on that, and that they have to do their part to assist them. And there's similar outreach efforts to try to assist Jews from the Tsarist Empire, particularly in France and England in the late 1870s, early 1880s. And right as there is this beginning of trickle of Jews out of the Tsarist Empire, the revolutionaries gain their revenge on Alexander II in March 1881 when they land up assassinating him. And while the murder of the Tsar was a profound blow that shook all of Europe, soon under the new Tsar, Alexander III, the autocracy consolidates itself and it enacts a new series of vicious anti-Semitic laws. And it's not just limited to the Tsarist Empire. With the help of Tsar Alexander III and his advisors, part of the international foreign policy of the Tsarist government is to try to spread anti-Semitism every place. And this particularly hits in New York, where leading social clubs, hotels, resorts suddenly decide that they have to behave just like the Russians, excluding the Jews. Soon, Denver is the same way on it. For example, while Jews help establish the Denver Athletic Club in 1884, soon the Denver Athletic Club has a no Jews policy. The same is true for years with the Denver Club, with the Denver Country Club. In fact, the origins of the old Green Gables Country Club were a response in the 1920s by affluent Jews that decided if all the Goyim can play golf, we should have the right to play golf, and what the city needs is a Jewish country club. Well, anyway, this is sort of a background that is going on, and meanwhile, Colorado is involved with a mining boom. And almost from the time of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush in 1858, 1859, there is this constant searching for mineral wealth. And no sooner is one lode seemingly discovered than too many people are seeking gold, silver there, and another lode is being sought after of this. And there's this constant drift of prospectors every place. Among the prospectors was Henry Thomas. Henry Thomas was better known as Gold Tom. And the reason he's called Gold Tom is supposedly he always has a pouch with gold dust on him, or he always has his eye looking for gold. Well, anyway, he leaves Central City about 1867, right when the Central City boom is rapidly going bust of this, and he wanders up to the headwaters of the Arkansas River. And again, from the time of the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, there was a lot of people were convinced that the area near the headwaters of the Arkansas had some great bonanza, and it took them until 1877 to discover that with the Leadville boom. Well, meanwhile, Gold Tom figures some of the minerals have probably washed down the Arkansas River of this, and he espies a spot about 35 miles off to the west of Canyon City, and as he's exploring this high rocky area that is rising in elevation from about 6,700 feet above sea level to 8,000 feet above sea level in only 4 miles, he sees towering off into the background the San de Cristo Mountains, the Blood of Christ Mountains, which of course is the ideal place for the Jews to land up settling. And he claims that the peak of the San de Cristos in the distance from this location in the valley right above the Arkansas River reminded him of the Cotopaxi volcano that he had once encountered in exploring Ecuador. So he names the new area Cotopaxi. And no sooner has he named it Cotopaxi than he is starting to file mining claims. Rather than gold, the major minerals that he comes across are silver and zinc. The problem that Gold Tom soon has is, though he has the mining claim, he doesn't have the capital to go and to develop the mining claim of this. And in virtually every mining boom, it's the same situation. The early prospector finds the mineral, but soon it's the bankers, the investors that go and get the money out of this and try to develop the claim. And the person that lands up buying out the claim of Gold Tom is Emmanuel Saltiel. Or maybe it's Chaltiel, or Chatil, or Satil. And everything about Emmanuel Saltiel is rather sketchy, dubious, questionable. For some, he's a great philanthropist. For some, he lands up becoming the ultra-villain of the Cotopaxi enterprise. According to the standard literature about Cotopaxi, Saltiel, which basically means I have requested of God, and Emmanuel along the way means God is with us, so he has this nice religious cloak. But anyway, supposedly he is a Portuguese Jew. That's among the erroneous claims about Cotopaxi. The Saltiel family were Sephardim, and they have been traced back to at least 14th century Spain. They land up being among the Jews that flee Spain in the face of the repression of Queen Isabella into the 16th century, and they land up in Crete and in Greece. In fact, sometimes the family is Chaltiel Gracian or Garcian there, with Gracian, Garcian, basically meaning Greek along the way. And for some centuries, the Saltiel family, which goes back and forth between Saltiel and Chatiel and Chaltiel and Chatil, of this, are in and out of Greece for a while. They're in Livorno, Italy. And in the late 18th century, some of the members of the family are in Holland. Others land up in England. And in fact, as much as anything, Emmanuel Saltiel is an Englishman. He's born in Bath, England in 1844. And the circumstances around his birth sort of are just hinting that he had a stormy life ahead of him. His father, Jacob John Saltiel, is part of a Portuguese-Spanish synagogue in Bath, which is in something of a rivalry, partly a partnership with a German synagogue. And Saltiel lands up marrying a German Jewish woman, who's also an English woman on that, named Harris of that. Well, no sooner is she pregnant with Emmanuel, and he's maybe in gestation for about 6 months or so, while still being married to her, Saltiel's father, Jacob John, lands up marrying a shiksa. And so he lands up actually being engaged in a bigamous marriage, and the English authorities see this. They land up finding him guilty of bigamy, lock him up for a month, and then he sort of gets released, and it's sort of really unclear of what happens on that. He lands up dying at age 28 in 1850, but Chaltiel is something of taken under the wings of other members of the family. He tends to get a fairly good education, being trained in metallurgy, in mining engineering in England. And then here's the next sort of who was this person? What really happened with him along the way is somewhere between 1860 and 1862. He sails for the United States. According to some accounts, he arrives in New York, where he has an uncle just before the Civil War. According to other accounts, he lands up in New Orleans in 1862, right before the Union Army liberates New Orleans, and he lands up being drafted into the Confederate Army. In the Confederate Army, he lands up emerging as a junior lieutenant, a chief of aide to part of the Confederate Army that is trying to defend Georgia in 1864 from the invasion of William Tecumseh Sherman. In the course of the Union Army's attack, they land up going and capturing Saltiel, and he's taken to a Union prison camp in Louisville. And as an officer, he is locked up in what is called the retaliation barracks. And what is happening is whenever the Confederacy goes and engages in a new horror, a new murder, a new act of terror, the Union Army goes into the retaliation barracks and may land up going and shooting or hanging a Confederate officer in revenge for this. And Saltiel, who always has his wits about him, realizes this is not a good place to stay. So what he lands up doing is sneaking out of the retaliation barracks. No sooner is he out of the retaliation barracks, he strips himself of his uniform and somehow gets on the miserable clothing of a rank and file private of the Confederate Army and lands up reporting to a barracks that is simply filled with rank and file soldiers from the Confederate Army of this. And that's where he's hiding out when the Union suddenly discovers we have had an officer escape from the retaliation barracks. And knowing that he better get out of Louisville, Saltiel agrees that he is going to be a galvanized Yankee. A galvanized Yankee is a term that is used for former members of the Confederate Army that agreed to join the Union Army during the Civil War. So they will not have to fight against the South. The Army then sends them out west to patrol against the Indians. Back in the 1960s, there was a television sitcom called F Fort. And F Fort was sort of a documentary, as much as a commentary or comedy about the crazy world of some of the Western forts, where there was a sky-high desertion rates, where officers who were drunks, incompetents, didn't fit into the regular army, landed up being stationed. Well, anyway, Saltiel lands up becoming Sergeant Joseph Isaacs. And he is assigned to Fort Rankin, which is also known as Fort Sedgwick, also known as Fort Julesburg at Julesburg, Colorado. And no sooner is he in Fort Rankin in 1865, he gets on the wrong side of the commander of his company there, a Captain Ferrer. And Captain Ferrer has two basic goals in the Army. One is to get drunk as often as possible. The other is to accumulate as much money as he can for his life after the war of this. And when things start going wrong at Camp Rankin, Captain Ferrer decides that Sergeant Isaacs, i.e. Saltiel, is the man that is responsible for all the problems on all of this. And he orders that Sergeant Isaacs be placed in chains and hauled up to Fort Laramie, where he is court-martialed for everything from mutiny to treason to insubordination in a total frame-up trial in the fall of 1865. After spending about 9 months in prison up in Fort Laramie, the Army lands up literally drumming Sergeant Isaacs Saltiel out of the Army, and no sooner has he left the Army up in Fort Laramie, he shows up in Denver. And the next thing you know, he's running a bookstore. The next thing you know, he's a newspaper writer, a newspaper editor. For a while in 1869, he is the co-owner of a Denver Daily Times newspaper that soon goes broke. He soon is up in Wyoming as a publisher, promoter up there. The next thing you know, he's back in New York as a mining man. And a mining man at this time is not a miner that's actually out there digging the mineral wealth out of the area. A mining man, rather, is, in the terms of Mark Twain, the owner of a hole in the ground that is a liar. And he's always buying and selling, marketing mining properties in New York, or maybe he's in St. Louis in the mid-1870s, and he's just constantly coming and going. Women are constantly coming and going from Satiel's life, where he is married at least 4 or 5 times with a string of divorces and desertions along the way. Well, anyway, he is now in the late 1870s investing in Cotopaxi, and this is a time when there is a big boom in mining through central, western Colorado. The Leadville boom is underway. The San Juan Mountain boom is underway. Railroad construction is going on, and there appears to be a great labor shortage along the way, and Satiel claims he just cannot find a reliable workforce of this. At least this is one of these claims. Or the other claim is this is the time of Tsarist anti-Semitism, the tensions in Russia, and Satiel decides he's going to go and help his religious fellows, even though he has no contact with any organized synagogue. He's never been observant of this, but somehow he lands up in the fall of 1880 making connections with Michael Heilprin. Michael Heilprin is born in the Russian section of Poland about 1822. He's from a family of scholars. He shows himself to be an outstanding linguist as a youth. Eventually, he's a master of upwards of 20 different tongues. With his father, he moves to Hungary in the early 1840s and joins the forces of opposition. And Hungary explodes into revolution in 1848, 1849. Louis Kossuth is the revolutionary leader of Hungary, whose efforts to fight the Habsburg Empire are capturing the imagination of the free world every place. And among the people that is allying with Kossuth, serving as a Kossuth, the aid of this as the Secretary of the Interior of Revolutionary Hungary is Michael Heilprin. When, with the help of Russian troops, the Hungarian counter-revolution succeeds in 1849, 1850, Heilprin flees to Paris. He's later in London, and about within a few years, 1858 or so, he's in New York. In New York, he's a scholar. He contributes to encyclopedias. He's among the founders, early contributors of The Nation, which is then a rather conservative, self-avowed liberal magazine of this. And again, other than having his traditions and being a scholar of Hebrew, he's not at all observant, has no real links, connections with the Jewish community. But as he is seeing the anti-Semitism in the Tsarist Empire, he's thinking that something ought to be done about this itself. And he is starting to think that maybe the best place to go and send all the Russian Jews is to the farming areas in Latin America, in Australia, in Canada, and throughout the United States. And this leads to yet Another theme through the 19th century, if not already at the time of the original settlement of the American colonies in the 17th century, there has been this agricultural idol that people need to get away from the evil cities, from poverty, from the misery of the old world, and by cooperating together, they can build a successful new life in the new world of this. Already in the 1830s, there's something called the Shalom Colony that is emerging in upstate New York that lasts for about 5 years. Early Colorado settlements, including what become Fort Collins and Greeley, start out as agricultural colonies. Near Cotopaxi is something that is called Wet Mountain. And in the course of the 1860s, 1870s, a German utopian colony is emerging around there itself on that. Added to all of this, among those that are embracing the ideal of Jewish agriculture are a lot of Russian Jews that are completely dissatisfied with their conditions under the czar of this. Early Zionists are already talking about planting kibbutzim in what becomes Israel at that period. Others, especially the eternal people, Olam, are saying, no, we need to look at Australia, at Latin America, Canada, the United States of that itself. And what's more, already under Tsar Alexander II, there had been permission for various Jewish colonies, especially near the Pale of Settlement, sort of right where the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia proper all come together. None of them are of the greatest success, as the Tsar's anti-Semitism is increasing at this time. Most of the Jewish agricultural colonies are shut down. Others fail. Among the people that was involved in some of the Russian agricultural colonies, the Jews, was Shul Ber MILLSTEIN. And the MILLSTEIN family and Cotopaxi are virtually synonymous of this. Shul Ber MILLSTEIN is headquartered at Brest of this. He's dabbled in cattle, in packing houses, in stock raising of that itself. He has a coterie of others that agree that maybe we ought to go to the New World and have a colony in there itself. On and on, there are these dreams of this. And by the late 1870s, he has an apple of his eye that he thinks is going to help him on this, is a nephew, Jacob MILLSTEIN. And he arranges for Jacob MILLSTEIN to leave Russia in 1878, 1879 for a couple of reasons. Number one is to escape the draft. The second is ideally Jacob MILLSTEIN will be able to scout out the atmosphere in the United States and to find an ideal location where the Jews can land up settling, and that the MILLSTEIN greater family of about 12 families, 50 people all told, and there's Shul Ber MILLSTEIN on camera right here, of that will be able to connect. However, no sooner has Jacob MILLSTEIN left the old world of this than his uncle, Shul Ber MILLSTEIN, realizes the guy's a scoundrel. And in particular, Jacob had arranged to run off with Shul's beloved daughter, Hannah, of this itself. And she escapes, runs away from her father, and in response, Shul Ber MILLSTEIN goes and refuses any connections with him at all. Or maybe they do stay in connections. Well, anyway, this is all the situation in the fall of 1880. The Tsarist anti-Semitism is growing. Michael Halprin in New York is talking about something ought to be done to help the Jews that are being forced to flee Russia of this, when Jacob MILLSTEIN makes connections with Michael Halprin. And at the same time that he's doing all of that, Halprin gets a letter from Emmanuel Sabtiel saying, "Do I have a deal for you? I have some idyllic farmland that will be ideal for a Jewish resettlement. I'll have about 2,000 acres, water. I will build cabins. I will provide barns. I will provide stock and plow, other farming equipment of this. And do I have a deal? I can give you all of this for $8,750 of this, plus about $1,250 in transportation from New York out to Cotopaxi. And this is going to be the cutting edge of religious hope, emancipation, and a model for what we can do with the Jews from the Tsarist Empire." And on this basis itself, where everybody is starting to think that this is a good idea, Michael Halprin joins with some other very prominent, very wealthy New York Jewish families' interests in 1881 to form something called HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. And it decides that having these colonies is a great idea. And besides, the people in New York, they don't want the Russian Jews settling next to them. And often they go and they approach the newcomers, the immigrants, and they say, "Okay, here's a map of the United States. Here's a map of Russia. Where is the pale of settlement in Russia? It's at the very edge of the country. And the Tsar and the anti-Semites won't allow you to go to Moscow and into the rich central parts of the Russian Empire. Now, here's the United States. Where do you want to stay? On the fringes? On this pale of settlement right off of the ocean? You're in free America right now. You should settle in the middle of the country of this." And so the idea is that Cotopaxi was to just be the beginning of this massive wave of Jewish agricultural settlement through the Western United States. And at the same time that this idea is growing, Schubert, MILLSTEIN, and company land up packing their bags, leaving Russia in 1881, sailing across the Atlantic, and land up in New York in the fall of 1881. And they appeal to HIAS for help on that. And soon HIAS, which is not well funded, is having to spend the bulk of its money to provide lodging, board for these Russian Jews, a party of about 50 or so originally on this there. So once the weather is clearing, it's getting a bit warm in the spring of 1882, they pack the MILLSTEIN clan on trains to Kansas City, to Pueblo, to Canyon City, and in early May 1882, 50 total people with 12 heads of family land up in Cotopaxi. Among the people that don't come at this time is Schubert MILLSTEIN. He's still extremely angry with his nephew and doesn't want to help his nephew in any way on this. Another guy that lands up missing from the early Cotopaxi colony is Jacob MILLSTEIN. And what had happened was he came out to Colorado in 1881 And instead of trying to make connections with Saltiel, he lands up with his wife, Nettie, up in Blackhawk. And by this time, Jacob had experienced some misfortune, being basically financially cut off by his uncle. He had gone to work in a tin factory in New York City. An accident there had blinded him in an eye of this. So he's not really part of the Cotopaxi leadership itself. The guy that is actually emerging as something of the link between Hias, Shatiel, and the MILLSTEIN family, the colonists, is yet another guy of rather questionable backgrounds, Julius Schwartz. Julius Schwartz is a Hungarian-born attorney, makes his way to Manhattan, makes connections with Michael Halprin. They both have that Hungarian background, and once the offer of Emil Shatiel reaches Halprin in 1881, he assigns Jacob Schwartz the role, Julius Schwartz, the role of going out and scouting out Cotopaxi and seeing, is this scheme worthwhile or not? And then among the controversies is what happens next. Seemingly, Julius Schwartz disappears. He never sends back the report. And the reason he doesn't send back the report is he never comes out to Colorado in 1880, 1881. Rather, he first comes to Colorado as something of the American escort for the colonists in March, April, May 1882. Well, amidst all of this, the colonists are met at the Cotopaxi Railroad Station by Emmanuel Shatiel and some of his partners, and they're placed in wagons and they're hauled 8-10 miles away from the railroad station. And incidentally, Shatiel originally wanted the railroad station, and the little settlement by it should have been called Satiel's. In 1880, the post office names it Cotopaxi, which is what everybody else was calling the area. Well, anyway, no sooner have the colonists gotten to their lush farms with the well-built cabins than they go, huh? What? It is a hideous area. It's rocky. It's hilly. There's no source of regular water. The only road is the dry bed of something called Oak Grove Creek that flows from where the colonists are settling down to the railroad station of this. Instead of these 3-room plus kitchen, 12 by 12 square foot houses that are about 10, 12 feet high, the colonists claim they're given these 6 by 6 foot 6 foot high shacks that are about 8 by 8. Some of them have no windows, some of them have no doors, no jams, whatever, and they're expected to go to work. And there's none of the farm animals that they expect in there because they were hoping to do some grazing, cattle raising, and instead they're told, nope, you're a bunch of Russian Jews. You're too weak to do stock raising, and you're too ignorant to do all of that. You're going to be great American farmers in the high Colorado Rockies. So they duly land up going and planting their crops. And meanwhile, the question of religion lands up coming on the scene. Apparently, most of the colonists were not observant or not very observant of that itself. They were rather part of what were called the Maskalim, the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment in Russia at this period. But now that they're in the New World, they're pulling on the religious traditions, which are primarily, it appears, but again, nothing is solid on this, but it appears they're Chasidim of this. And among their very first requests to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society is, please send us a Torah. This gets national publicity in the Jewish press. They dedicate a synagogue in June 1882. By this time, a couple of infants have died. One of the first settlers lands up dying. Soon, Nettie and Jacob MILLSTEIN arrive of that, and soon there's about 63 colonists instead, and they have three burials of this. They create a small Cotopaxi cemetery, but still, they're hurting. They're running low on money of that itself. And then there is typical high country Colorado weather where the cold is pouring in September, October, and their crops basically freeze before they have the opportunity to go and harvest them. And by the winter of 1882, they are hurting. They are begging in terms of, we need help along the way. And they make contact with the Denver Jewish community. And the Denver Jewish community is, oh, there are fellow religionists. We better check out what's going on. And a guy named George Cohn, an attorney, goes down there. He sees how bad the circumstances are on this. The Denver Jewish community is trying to help. Meanwhile, labor is in demand around Cotopaxi. And among the prime employers around Cotopaxi is Emmanuel Saltiel. And he announces that he will hire his co-religionists for $1.50 a day or $2.50 a night, at the same time that miners and muckers in nearby Leadville are making about $3 a day of that, which gives rise to the charge that Saltiel was cynically trying to exploit them. Meanwhile, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad is building very avidly in the area, and jobs are available of grading trains, of digging, installing ties. So a lot of the crews are going in there, and word about how bad a shape the colony is spreads, and often railroad firemen, engineers will dump extra coal down so the colonists can keep a bit warm. The German colony in Wet Mountain has some communications where some are speaking Yiddish, some are speaking German, and they actually understand each other. And so the Wet Mountain colony is assisting them. And meanwhile, word of this gets back to Hias in New York of this. And Hias is sort of shocked by what is going on with this, and it doesn't have the funds, or it doesn't want to pay the funds to help Cotopaxi at this time. And what makes things even worse is right about this period, Michael Halprin's health totally collapses, and he has to step down from a leadership role at Cotopaxi, Hias of that. And the guy that takes charge of Hias is H.S. Henry. And when he lands up hearing about what's going on and all the complaints of Cotopaxi, he responds that the problems are in large part due to the fact that the Russian refugee prefers begging of his fellow Hebrews to expending money that he has earned by his daily labor, however small that labor may be, for the supply of anything beyond the commonest accessories of life. In other words, the people in Cotopaxi are a bunch of beggars, and if they don't work, they just might as well starve. And what's more, according to Henry, the Goyim have discovered what's going on in Cotopaxi. A Denver newspaper sends a reporter to Cotopaxi and talks about Saltiel and his dubious past, to say the least of that. The Rocky Mountain News sends a reporter, says, Yeah, they're hurting. Every pioneer hurts. What's the big deal in terms of all of this? There, of that New York newspapers, Polish Jewish newspapers, Jewish newspapers in what is then St. Petersburg, the capital of the Russian Empire, pick up on this. So there's a lot going on, a lot of controversy with Cotopaxi. And then the colonists discover that property deeds that they were supposed to have filed in Fremont County so that the land would become theirs under a homestead claim had never been filed by Satiel, and that Satiel owned all the land, and they were nothing more than his tenants and were creating no sweat equity. If this is not bad enough, the weather in 1883 is just like the weather in 1882. Mashogana, uneven, freezing, and the second crop fails in 1883. And right about that time, finally, there is a settlement between Satiel, the Jewish colonist itself, Hias, other such things, where Hias agrees it's going to pay $100 each to the families that had settled in Cotopaxi with the official dissolution of both Hias and Cotopaxi in late 1883. At least that's one account of this. Some of the colonists decide they're going to stick it out for the winter of 1883, 1884, and plant crops in the spring of 1884. And once they have landed up doing so, we have another freeze, and that's sort of the killer blow to Cotopaxi. Meanwhile, Hias is dissolved, and no sooner is it dissolved than it's sort of semi-reincarnated at this time. It goes through a number of different name changes until it lands up emerging as the contemporary Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society itself. And in its official history, it traces itself to 1881 with the foundation of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. Well, meanwhile, Cotopaxi has national importance. The failure of Cotopaxi, in many ways, is the failure of the colony idea that we can somehow ship all of the Jews away from New York into the great American plains out of that. But ideas and efforts to have some sort of Jewish agricultural colonies keep persisting. The best known one in Colorado after Cotopaxi is at Atwood, Colorado, near Sterling, that lasts from about 1894 to 1899 of this. Then in the early 20th century, there's something called the Galveston movement. And in the case of the Galveston movement, the idea is that the Jews should not sail into New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore. They instead should enter the United States via Galveston, Texas, and become good Texans and settle in the Great Plains that way. And again, that never quite works out. Well, what happens on is that most of the survivors of Cotopaxi land up staying in Colorado. Some of them file homestead claims. And right about the time that the Cotopaxi colony is completely collapsing, finally, Schulbear MILLSTEIN lands up making his way to Denver. Soon he has his own stock farm, slaughterhouse. Members of the family are in warehousing. The MILLSTEIN family is closely interlinked with the Shamus family, the Shames family. Again, they pronounce it different ways. And before long, you can start looking at the genealogy of the Cotopaxi settlers, and it is absolutely immense of this. In fact, The late Ida Uchel, who was the pioneer historian of Jewish Colorado, used to joke that every Jewish family that settled in Colorado by World War I was somehow interrelated with every other Jewish family, with Cotopaxi being a key link along the way. Among the contributions of the Cotopaxi settlement is they land up forming Denver's second synagogue, Zara Abraham, about 1887 or so of this. And originally that was located right about West Colfax Avenue and the Platte River itself as a Hasidic synagogue. And a lot of the German Jews of Denver were glad to see the launch of Zara Abraham. That would keep these East European Jews out of Temple Emanuel, which was the Reformed German synagogue that's well established by this time of that. Before long, Zara Abraham moves up the hill to a building that was once called the Labor Lyceum over about West Conejos Place and Julian Street. Conejos, there's the picture, is half a block north of Colfax up there. Then in the early 1960s, Zara Abraham moves to its current location near Colfax and Xavier, where some claim its new temple sort of looked like a flying saucer staring down through the area of that itself. But a lot of the Cotopaxi settlers were not content to remain Chasidim of this. Some of them become Reformed Jews along the way out of it. Among the descendants of the Bear MILLSTEIN family was Phil MILLSTEIN, who is this very, very important figure in mid-20th century Denver, head of the Chamber of Commerce, downtown booster, the key figure in creating the 16th Street Mall, a crucial figure in forming the Auraria Higher Education Center, president of Temple Emanuel, sees that it locates on Hilltop, on and on with that. Meanwhile, there is a plaque up in Cotopaxi these days, and that's, again, something of a change of this. When I did my book in the early 1990s, Exploring Jewish Colorado, I have a short chapter on Cotopaxi, and I was observing that there was nothing up in Cotopaxi really going and commemorating the Jewish colony since then. And since the book came out, not only has there become a Cotopaxi Historical Society, the state of Colorado has put a little plaque nearby. There's a plaque by the cemetery. A shul down in Canyon City has sort of adopted the cemetery, put a menorah, other markers up on that. Debates over the internet and other publications keep claiming, is Shatiel a hero or a scoundrel, on and on. And I tend to go and look at the scoundrel technique, because after Cotopaxi, he drifts around, he's in New York, he's in Denver, he continues to land up being a mining investor of that itself. And then he gets national attention in the mid 1890s, where it comes out that he and two Confederates are running a rather dubious property investment scheme in Denver, New York, and Butte, Montana, of basically forging property deeds, mortgaging these phony property deeds, getting the cash, and disappearing along the way. And when this comes out, Shatiel lands up going to northern Carbon County, Wyoming, and he settles in about 50 miles to the north of the closest city, Rollins, New York. And he, by this time, is on about his fifth wife, lands up dying at age 55 in January 1900. Originally, when they take his body to the Rollins Cemetery, The cemetery rejects it because he's not a Christian. Eventually, the Episcopalians allow him to be buried there. A son, his last wife are buried up there. There was a Jewish legacy in Carbon County until about 1980 or so. So those are just part and parcel of some of the schemes that are going on with Cotopaxi.